In this video, in just a few moments, I'm going to share with you the thoughts and opinion of my good friend and fellow trader, Charlie Burton. And Charlie's got some very interesting insights and opinions about Bitcoin. I'll share that with you in just a few moments. Before we do that though, I just want to quickly mention some important points about the Bitcoin ETF. You might have heard the news recently that the SEC decided to delay the decision on the Bitcoin ETF. As you can see here from this interesting Forbes article, which was posted just recently, what is next after the SEC's Bitcoin ETF decision. At the end of this article, there's something very interesting I want to share with you. Let's go and talk about this now. So at the end, he asks a very interesting question. He says, the major question is how any pending SEC decision could impact the price of Bitcoin in the future. And he gives three scenarios. And the three scenarios he gives are these. Firstly, he says, if the SEC continues to keep delaying the decision, it's likely that the price will remain in some sort of range. So the first one is some sort of range, in other words, sideways move. Then he says, if the SEC delivers a negative verdict on the Bitcoin ETF, it's likely to push the price lower, and actually previous support levels will gain the most amount of attention. And he mentions support levels like 6,000, 5,000, 4,000, 3,130. Now here's where it gets interesting. He says, if the SEC decides that it's about time to let things go and turn on the green light, in other words, approve the Bitcoin ETF, it could create a major FOMO among investors, which could lead the price ripping to the upside. Okay, so in other words, what he's saying is, if the SEC approves the Bitcoin ETF and gives it the green light, then very likely we could see the price of Bitcoin going much higher because the FOMO crowd are getting in on the action. Now, if you just think about that for a second, you will understand and probably realize there's something actually quite wrong here, because he is not saying that professionals are going to push the price up. He's saying the FOMO crowd, the FOMO, in other words, the fear of missing out crowd, the FOMO investors are going to push the price up probably massively higher. The problem is, I'm sure you probably realized, that is actually a bearish scenario, not a bullish scenario. Remember, guys, that when the FOMO crowd are getting in, that usually means we're about a turning point. That's actually quite a bearish scenario for Bitcoin. In fact, let me explain to you why. The reason why that is actually bearish is because one of the most important rules in analysis is professionals buy on the rumor, they sell on the news. Let me repeat that. It's quite important. Professionals, in other words, the institutions, they buy on the rumor, they sell on the news. Professionals very rarely buy on the news itself. If anything, what professionals do is they dump their holdings after the news comes out. Okay, let me just show you an example of this. Here's a good chart demonstration of this. So usually when there's a rumor of something happening, again, guys, remember, professionals, insiders, institutions, they have access to information and data that we don't have access to. That's why they're called insiders. So usually they start piling up on that kind of rumor of something happening, pushing the price up, causing a rally. But when the news comes out, when the announcement is made, that is actually when they start unloading and dumping their holdings onto who? Onto everybody else, onto the FOMO crowd, okay, onto the average folks. So it's not like professionals getting in here when the news comes out. No, professionals actually sell their holdings onto everybody else. And that's something important to bear in mind, guys. Because if that is the case, then therefore, when the news comes out, yes, there might be a temporary spike in the price of Bitcoin, but actually very likely that spike or rally probably won't last for very long before finally the professionals unload everything, causing a retracement. Notice after the news comes out, there's usually a retracement or a correction or drop in the price. Here's a good example for you. Here it is on Bitcoin. There's a perfectly good example about a few years ago. As you can see here, professionals, again, quietly buying in on the rumor. Okay, buying on the rumor. Notice, for example, how these key moving averages crossing over in the positive direction. And then when the news eventually comes out, okay, so let's say the news comes out about, let's say here, that causes a spike in the price. You can see here, spike in the price, but notice the spike does not last for very long. The rally does not last for very long. This volatility is usually caused by the news events coming out, but this is usually when professionals start dumping their holdings onto everybody else, the FOMO crowd, the fear of missing out crowd, causing the price to reverse, and boom, price then drops, causing a retracement. And by the way, guys, let's not forget this. This time round, there will be short sellers involved in this too. So maybe a few years ago, we didn't have short sellers, but now we do have short sellers getting in on the action and that actually causes the price to push down potentially even further. All right, guys, so the bottom line is professionals usually start waiting. Professionals wait for the retracement, wait for the drop to occur, and then they start piling up near the support levels. So guys, what this teaches us is something very important, which is that whatever we might expect Bitcoin to do, whatever the majority of people think is going to happen when the Bitcoin ETF news is going to come out. Now, whether the news is positive or negative, we don't know. But whatever we think is going to happen, whatever the obvious consequence is going to be, usually the opposite happens. So anybody out there who thinks that a good decision, in other words, a positive decision by the SEC on the Bitcoin ETF is going to cause the price to rip to the upside, maybe temporarily, but it probably won't last for very long. Because remember, guys, that is usually when professionals start unloading their positions onto everybody else, onto the FOMO crowd, causing the price to drop. This is exactly what happens in almost any market. Happens on Bitcoin, happens on stock markets, happens also on the currency markets. Let's go now and talk about Charlie Burton, my good friend and fellow trader. Let me share with you what Charlie is saying, which is quite interesting. So let's go to one of his most recent videos. Here's a video that Charlie published just quite recently. And Charlie said in his video that Bitcoin has some important support levels near the 6,000 level. So he mentioned these important support levels near the 6,000 region. And according to Charlie, what most likely could happen on Bitcoin is a pullback or retracement, similar to what we discussed in our previous video, back down to the 6,000 level. Charlie believes that because these levels have been tested so many times in the past, these levels near the 6,000 range, that it's quite likely that Bitcoin could come back and test these levels one more time. I actually think this is a high probability scenario for Bitcoin as well. In fact, I mentioned this in my own video last week. As you may remember, in the video I published about if Bitcoin has bottomed, then what is the most likely scenario for Bitcoin? In that video, I mentioned that a likely retracement back down to support levels. In fact, I would go further than Charlie. I would say that perhaps levels below the 6,000 level could be tested. For example, the 50% retracement, or even the 61.8% retracement. These are near the 5,700 to 5,100 levels, and even the key averages on the weekly time frame as well. And as I mentioned in my previous video, these are levels that could be tested before a potential bounce in the price of Bitcoin occurs. Now, whether that bounce is going to result in a new wave higher, we shall wait and see, but it all depends on whether Bitcoin has bottomed or not. If Bitcoin has bottomed, as I mentioned in my previous video, then it's likely that bounce that occurs near these levels could lead to the next wave, potential wave 3, long-term wave 3 on Bitcoin. Of course, in another video, we'll talk about the possibility of Bitcoin having not bottomed as well. So guys, what we have to remember is that experience has taught us that whatever the SEC decision is going to be about a Bitcoin ETF, whatever the news is going to be, whatever we think is going to be the direct result of that news, usually the opposite is likely to happen. Okay? Remember, if it was so obvious that something's going to happen, then you're not the only person who's thinking it. Professionals and insiders have thought about it too.